Good evening. I'm Akusia Samwa, trustee of the New York Society Library and member of the Lecture and Exhibition Committee. On behalf of both, welcome. We're pleased to be presenting a range of events about fiction, history, and more, most of it live streaming just like this, with limited in-person audiences beginning in October. Take a look at our website for full listings. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's event, a one-of-a-kind conversation between rising star fiction writers Dantiel W. Moniz and Deesha Philyaw. Dantiel W. Moniz is the recipient of a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 Award, a Pushcart Prize, a McDowell Fellowship, and the Alice Hoffman Prize for Fiction. Her work has appeared in the Paris Review, Harper's Bazaar, American Short Fiction, Tin House, and elsewhere. Her debut collection, Milk, Blood, Heat, is set among the cities and suburbs of Florida, and each story delves into the ordinary worlds of young girls, women, and men who find themselves confronted by extraordinary moments of violent personal reckoning. Milk, Blood, Heat is an indie next pick and has been hailed as a must-read by Time, Entertainment Weekly, and the Oprah magazine, among others. The Washington Post praised the collection as exhilarating and shocking and even healing. Ms. Moniz is an assistant professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Deesha Philyaw is the author of the debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, and her writing in race, gender, culture has appeared in the New York Times and Harvard Review, among others. The 9 beautiful stories in The Secret Lives of Church Ladies explore the raw and tender places where Black women and girls dare to follow their desires and pursue a momentary reprieve from being good. The collection was praised as luminous stories populated by deeply moving and multifaceted characters by Kirkus Reviews, and addictive, while also laying bare the depth and vulnerability of Black women by Observer. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies won the 2021 Faulkner Award for Fiction, the 2020-2021 Story Prize, and a 2020 LA Times Book Prize. The collection was also a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction and is being developed for television by Tessa Thompson for HBO Max. Ms. Philyaw will be the 2022-23 John and Renee Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. On a personal note, I read both of these collections and was captivated by these works and excited for tonight's conversation. I encourage you to buy both books from our independent friends at the Cornerstone Bookstore. You can find the link in the chat. Please add your own questions, comments to the chat throughout the evening, and the authors will address them later in the programming. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dantiel W. Moniz and Deesha Philyaw. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful welcome.
Deesha!
Dantiel. I just like us as the 3Ds. We're missing our Donnies. So.
Yeah, we're missing, wait, you're Big D. I'm Baby D.
And Donnie is Middle D.
She's Middle D. That's right.
She's Middle D. Yes. So good to see you. As we were saying, it's been a minute. We've both been busy. You've been moving. You're teaching. Lots of great things happening. But I am thrilled to just chop it up with you tonight.
Yes. So we're just gonna get right into it. If that's good with you, D. So I've been thinking a lot about writing and visibility lately, just in terms of my own process and, what does that mean to gain a platform? And so there's been a couple of pieces that have been out lately. One was on Gail Jones, one was on Ann Petrie, and they were both really interesting to think about these these two writers who are super formative and kind of like receded from, the public eye. And so I have a quote here from the Ann Petrie piece, which is, "Continuous public exposure, though it may make you a personality, can diminish you as a person. To be a willing accomplice to the invasion of your own privacy puts a low price on its worth. The creative processes are, or should be, essentially secret. And although naked flesh is now an open commodity, the naked spirit should have sanctuary." And so I was just wondering, as two writers who are coming up and arriving, right? Like a lot of big shit is happening, like for us. I'm wondering, like, do you agree, and how you think about visibility in your own creative process and what you're doing to protect that space as your platform grows larger?
Yeah, the thing that struck me about that quote is that she was saying this pre-social media, but it is so, of the moment and of the time. And, I think it forces a couple of things. I think it forces kind of a balancing act because, I just love what she talked about, it being this sanctuary and the naked spirit, which is where we are when we create. But then there's the business of writing, and we're not all Gail Jones who can write a book, do no publicity, and have it be successful. So there's this need that we have to become salespeople, marketers. You've got to do all of that on top of knowing how to write a book that people want to read, and then making sure that it, I think she's talking a bit like about erosion here, that we can erode away our spirit, our time, if we're focused so much on the platform part. And I found that what helps me, other than just, taking breaks, but also, just limiting and being really intentional about how much time do I spend engaging in public life as a writer, which mostly for us, other than events like this, it's social media. But that word, you talked about platform, it has all these different facets. And I think if we think about what Toni Morrison said, because a platform is a source of power. And she talked about the whole purpose of having power is to empower someone else. So I think we can be engaged in, public life in the literary community by supporting other writers, and a lot of that is done privately. A lot of that is done more quietly. And so the platform can be multiple things, and we can navigate it in a way that benefits us as artists and benefits our fellow artists.
Yeah, I agree. And you've been like amazing at using your platform to do exactly that. Like every time I turn around, you know what I mean? It's you spreading and, giving back. And, I try to do the same things, any resources that I have that I can demystify this really opaque publishing industry, right? It's like, okay, let me tell you exactly what the money was. Let's talk about the money, that kind of thing. But I think too, I'm really interested in thinking about like being so immersed into the public facing part that you forget and lose touch with where your own creative center is. Like, what do you want to write for you versus what do you think will sell and things? But I do think you make a really great point about the fact that for most of us, like anybody who's trying to be a writer and be published, like especially in these more traditional ways, but like especially for marginalized writers, especially for Black women, you do have to be the front runner of your own success. You can't just afford to be like, okay, I'm going to sit back now, not into this this landscape where there's a million books coming out every Tuesday.
Right.
You know what I mean? And most of the promotion is on you. So I think for me, I feel like I haven't hit that spot yet. My book's been out like 7 months. So I haven't hit that spot where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take my social media break. You know what I mean? Because there's still events to do and there's still like, okay. And I'm trying to, do that. But I am looking forward to kind of that spot where I can kind of chill for a second and like recenter and be like, okay, what am I excited to work on right now? Yeah. So I think it is balance, like you're saying. And then using that platform, not just for your own gain, but for like, okay, now in what ways can I give back?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Dantiel, kind of related to that question about now that the books are out, because there's like life, there's a line, life before the books, life after the books. Let's talk about how having our books in the world has changed the way we teach and advise emerging writers. How has that shifted for you?
Yeah. So, like I said, I'm someone who, even before I had this book, even before
Mhm.
I had an agent, whatever resources I had, like if I had applied to a contest that I won or whatever, and then somebody else was like, "Hey, I'm applying to this contest," I'm like, "Oh, do you want to see my cover letter?" That kind
Yeah,
of thing. So I
yeah.
think I've always had a sense of whatever I have, no matter if I'm at the very beginning or wherever I
Mhm,
am in my career, I'm always going to share what I have. And so I think the
mhm,
same thing is for my teaching. My teaching is always evolving to be like, what is going to be most useful
mhm.
for these students to understand about their creative writing processes. Not only
Yeah.
that, but then the business part
Yes.
afterwards. I think
Yeah.
for me, I come from an MFA program where they
Mhm,
were, they didn't want us to worry about publishing too early, but they were always like, well, this is what this looks like. You know what I mean? And I
mhm,
think the unknown is the thing that's the most scary when,
mhm.
you're a beginning writer and you're like, well, what does that look like? Because there's a difference between being a writer and an author, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so for me, I think I always want to kind of delve into that and just demystify it a little bit. But
Mhm,
I think my teaching process is always changing because I'm always changing. And so
mhm,
when I
mhm.
get new knowledge about something, or like I come up against something that I was like, okay, this makes me think about my own process. Now, how can
Mhm.
I kind of
Yeah.
direct that to my teaching so that I can make sure that, to the best of my ability,
Mhm,
I'm giving the most direct knowledge that I can.
mhm.
What about you?
Yeah, I think it's like on the craft side and the business side. And on the craft side, I feel like now I can confidently say, you really can write whatever you want.
Yes.
You really can. Here's my book, here's Dantiel's book, here's Donnie's book. You really can do what you want to do. Because we know that there can be discouraging, and you can have different forces and voices telling you have to write to this, or you have to, no one's going to read, or you can't find an audience. All of those things are discouraging. So first, I try and offer that encouragement and that freedom and that permission. Because so often I think we're waiting for permission and validation when we're,
Yes.
newer at this. And then I think on I guess, I was going to say the business side, but like the community side, trying to encourage people to think of themselves as part of a literary community, because that's what I discovered, that it was partly about the book that I wrote. And then there's a big part of it that's about the people who I'm in community with.
Yeah.
And that matters. It matters a whole lot. And it matters because so much of this is subjective. A lot of great books never get awards and
Never.
all of that kind of stuff. It's a fickle business. We know there's also bias and those sorts of things. So I used to say, oh, it's your talent, and it's your skills and your willingness to, to take risks and all of that, and then luck. And that never
Yes.
landed well. And so now here's what I'm saying: instead of luck, it's access, right?
Mm.
Because me getting to know Kiese Layman and the way he supported me, that's not luck. Those things happen, but because of Kiese, I've had access that I wouldn't have had, and now I'm trying to be somebody else's Kiese.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk to students and emerging writers about finding your people, finding that community, of people who are aspirational for you. You want to be where they are, but also the people who are at your level. That's going to be your squad, and they're going to be like you. I applied for this contest. You should apply too. Part of my community are folks who are like, oh yeah, don't forget to apply for that Guggenheim Fellowship. I just turned mine in, and oh, by the way, here's some tips. Like that's access. And so, how can we empower each other, and how can we create more access to deal with, the gatekeeping and all of the rejection that's just sort of built into the system?
Yeah, I agree. I think too, instead of luck, I have been trying to think of like timing, because you can
Hmm.
be talented, you can be determined, you can be, but you
Yes.
know what I mean? It's all of
Yeah.
these things lining up. And that's like maybe a different word for something that's like a
Mhm.
little bit outside of your control, but it's not
Yeah.
as like woo woo as like
Right.
it's
Right.
luck. Do you know what I mean? But I'm
Yeah.
also thinking, because last semester I taught a fiction workshop, and I titled
Mhm.
it community and care, basically, because I
Yes.
also have started, and since 2020 and over this last 7 months of my book being published, I've been
Mhm.
starting to think of my creativity as a whole body process. Like,
Mm.
in the writing world, it's very
Mhm.
romanticized to have people who have these very destructive or self-destructive behaviors and be like,
Yeah.
oh, but they were a great writer, da 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 da.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that, like, my body is a thing that requires something of me, and me taking care of it to the best of my ability also enhances my own creativity. So I'm trying to tell my students, hey, yes, the writing, yes, this thing, but also check in with yourself and see, what does my body need of me in this moment? Is that rest? Is that water? Is that, sunlight, whatever it looks like. But just trying to unfold that into the creative process, because they're connected. And the reason why everything gets out of whack is because we become so disconnected from our bodies, and that it makes it easier to be creative and connected to your creativity when you are connected with your body. So that's the other thing. Okay, so because we talked about community, right? And finding your squad, which I think is so important. And, again, you hear all the time, writing is a solitary practice, but that is true up until a certain point. And then you have the people in your corner who can help you do what you're trying to do. So what words of encouragement do you have for other writers, and especially Black writers coming up into an industry that often likes to profit off Black culture and trauma with no real investment?
I think it goes back to what we said a little while ago, which is write what you want to write. But I think we also have to interrogate sometimes, why do I want to write this? Because sometimes we are, we've been influenced by this idea of either what sells or what we think we should be writing, or what we think Black writing is. Like, you and I have talked about this.
Yes, a lot.
What does it mean to be a Black writer? Does that mean your characters are all Black, or and so I think it's really this sort of internal process of questioning yourself and your own motivations. I remember early on, gosh, I hadn't published anything, and I was working on a novel, and I went to this community writing workshop for Black writers here in Pittsburgh, and August Wilson had co-founded it many, many years earlier. And I read something from this novel I was working on, and this man said to me, "Are these people Black?" And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, what makes them Black? I said, what makes you Black? And so, I think you run into those kinds of things, and understanding that, your writing belongs to you first and foremost. And can you sleep with this at night? Are these the stories that you came to tell? And so sometimes that might have some connection points to trauma, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, we may find there's something else we want to write about, and that is just as Black and just as valid. And then trusting that your work will find its audience. And you and I both know that because we will live, eat, sleep, and breathe these books for at least a year, you really have to be feeling it. And so writing something because you feel like the larger culture is telling you that this is what Black is, or this is what's going to sell, then you're stuck with something that your heart's not in it. And I can't imagine, doing all the stuff we do for something that we feel, that I feel lukewarm about,
Yeah, that makes me think of that. We had a conversation about this. Someone being like, "Oh, can you ghostwrite my book?" And I had a thought, like, it takes so much work and so much soul and so much energy to write a book. Why would I write a book that wasn't for me first and foremost? You know what I mean? And then whatever else reach it has after that, then that's good. But I think that's the thing that mostly, because when I was first writing stories, I wasn't writing stories about Black girls and women. And I'm not saying that that's the only thing that I'm allowed to write about, because I'm very strident about I want to write whatever I want to write, whatever I feel called to be. But I also do that examination process that you said, which is, why do I feel called to write this thing? And if it's something that is outside of my identity, how is my identity kind of intersecting with these points? And what research do I need to do to make sure that I'm, being as faithful as possible to the community that I'm trying to write about, or whatever it is. But Blackness is not a monolith. That's the biggest thing that I came up with, once I started understanding that, all of my stories were about little white girls who were rich, that I had no idea what that was. And I was like, wait, why don't I feel like I can write a story, from my experience? And it's just because, I had been told that those were these certain narrow types of stories. And that's not true, right? A Black story is if you're Black, your Blackness is enough. You don't have to hold it up its definition against anybody else's. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the same thing with stories, regardless of who you are. You get to define what stories that you're telling, and just trust yourself. And I think that's the other thing that I try to teach in class too. So the community part, I think, is absolutely crucial in what we do as writers. But I do think it's important to protect that part that is individual and unique.
Yeah.
Until you understand what it is, so that a community can be useful to you in your writing. Do you know what I mean? Too many voices, like you said.
And I think also something else that, you know, I try to emphasize is this idea of, to be a good writer, you got to be a good reader, you know? And so when you're interrogating your own intentions, when you're interrogating, you know, what it is, you know, what story you feel drawn to, we have to be aware of, you know, these forces that are often invisible, you know, that tell us and inform us. And then, you know, knowing sort of historically the context for the work that we're doing, you know, it's so tempting to be like, no one's ever written anything like this before, you know, and it's like, but all of our work has some sort of context, some sort of social or cultural or historical context. And, you know, and this gets tricky because, you know, people don't want you to tell them, you know, what to write. And I would never tell people what to write. I just ask people to think about harm, you know.
Yes.
And what is the potential for harm, and what do you want your work to accomplish? What are you trying to do? And then is that, you know, are you going about it in a way that it's going to accomplish what you want to accomplish? And be mindful of these, you know, of tropes, you know,
100%.
all of those kinds of things. But you don't know all of that stuff if you don't read, you know.
Right, exactly. And I think, like, at the end of the day, if like your reason for like wanting to write a certain thing is, oh, this seems popular right now, or this is trending, it's like, you know what I mean? Like every time someone says like, oh, this is trending, so I'm going to write, by the time you actually publish that book, it's such a long process. That thing's going to be old and dead. So it's like, you got to write what you want to write. And then when you're writing like truly from the center of yourself in that way, you find the people who it's for. Do you know what I mean? You always can find your people, regardless of someone, you know, if that audience looks like it's, you know, 200 people, or if it's 2 million, you know, you find your people. And that's like the most gratifying part of writing so far for me, is like those people who reach out to me. I was like, wow, this book really saw me. And I'm like, cool, that's really cool.
And you know, I think that the way the emulation that kind of works is where we kind of challenge ourselves, right? And so you know, it was a challenge for me to write a story where the main character was not a Black woman, it was a Black man. You know, that was a huge deal for me. Or looking at friends like, you know, Nafisa Thompson Spires, and then saying, you know what, I want to try my hand at satire. Like she did, she was just so wild.
She's a genius. She's a genius.
She is absolute genius. And I want to, you know, try that kind of thing, but see what I can do, you know, that sort of thing. And, you know, looking at people, not to say, okay, because I need to be on this trend, but because I'm trying to grow as a writer. You know, I haven't tried my hand at this yet. So I want to, you know, I want to give this a try and play and experiment. Play. Serious.
Play. That's the other thing that's super important. I think as soon as we start thinking of our writing as this thing that can, you know, gain achievements or gain us something, then we kind of lose that idea. Like, do you remember when you used to just write because like that's what you did to entertain yourself? Is like tell yourself stories. And I think you know, there's a period of time when you're a new writer, you're like, oh, okay, this is serious. I have to be serious, because you get the, you know, all this different advice coming from different places about what it means to be a writer and how to do that. And I think like we forget that we enjoy it. We forget that it's something that it's too hard to do to not enjoy doing it. Like if you don't like it, like you don't have to do it. But like I think we forget that we can enjoy it and what it looks like to play, and that nobody has to ever see your drafts. And like I think it goes back to your point about reading widely. Like even if it's not something that you write, just taking in all of these different craft techniques and like, oh, this is so interesting. I wonder what I can do with it, like you said.
And I think we just came full circle to your question about, you know, an industry that really wants us to focus on, you know, Black culture and trauma, that when we do what you just described, we can land on so many other possibilities, you know, instead of just, you know, the ones that were people try and kind of pigeonhole us. So I got a question for you on this topic of play. I'm curious, in your collection, which of the stories did you have the most fun writing, where you really got to play?
Yeah, I think for me, that story would probably be Exotics. You know what I mean? It was the shortest story. It's the shortest one. So you could call it a flash fiction, but like for me, it was kind of like this like fun challenge to be like, okay, I have this story in my head. In my head, it's like, it's not very long. So how can I tell this complete story and get all of the emotional impact of like these other stories that are much larger in this little tiny package, while also like, you know what I mean? Kind of like alluding to what the situation is without being like, I don't know how to say it, bare-assed about it. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know, that was fun for me to be like, did I do it? Did I, you know what I mean? Did what I was intending come across on the page?
Yeah.
What about for you?
It's definitely How to Make Love to a Physicist.
I love that
one. All the sensory details, and it's really a lush story. There's a lot of food in that story. There's a lot of touching. There's kissing. There's even science, that I nerded out doing the research on that. And then, I was answering some of my own questions around science and religion and how to, reconcile things. So I was just, all in on that one. That was fun to do.
I think that comes across, I really do. Like when you're reading it, you can just kind of sense like the lightness behind the language as well. And it like carries you through to the end of this. Anyway, I love that. I love your book.
So speaking of, next question.
So, we just talked a little bit about our books, but I think a lot of the times the mother-daughter relationships in our books get highlighted. And I was wondering about our intentions around like those chosen families. So, like the play cousins, your friends, your, lovers. How do you feel that those relationships are nourishing self-awareness in your characters and in yourself?
So I feel like I neglected them in Church Ladies, in that collection. These characters are so lonely, so much of their lives are lived in secret. And yet the mother-daughter relationships really loomed large in most of the stories. And that wasn't even my intention. I think that was me having some stuff that I needed to work out with my own mother, who passed away in 2005. And so there were these residual things that came up. But interestingly, my next collection, I'm going to get intentional about the mothers and daughters, but I don't want my characters to be as solitary and as lonely as they were in Church Ladies. And so they are going to lean more on siblings and on platonic friends and those kinds of relationships. So I think that makes them fuller characters. And it also gives a nice, can be a counter to the mother-daughter dynamic. Because I started thinking about that. I was like, do these characters have siblings? Because I was an only child. And so I think it was like really natural for me to kind of forget about that. And I think even in the last, year and a half, the way I've leaned more deeply into my own friendships, I think that's going to show up in these stories in a way that it may not have if we haven't as we are currently still living through a pandemic.
Through the pandemic. Yeah, I agree. My collection, same with the mother-daughter relationships. It was something that I was trying to work out. What does it mean to realize that your mother or your daughter is a person outside of you, outside of that relationship to you? And then like, does that allow more grace into the relationship when you think about that? Like, this is the first time we're both living on this earth together. You know what I mean? Most of the time we're doing the best we can. And sometimes we are receiving love that we feel like isn't the love that we, needed. But it's the love that the other person has to give. And so I think that, so that's something that gets talked about all the time, but there are siblings and cousins and friends in my book that I do think are just as important as mirrors, right? And sometimes even, I want to say more important, but like sometimes it's a truer mirror to kind of reflect off yourself. Do you know what I mean? I was thinking about the siblings too in my story. There's a pair of siblings and they both have like, they grew up together, but they both have different images and memories of their father, right? And it's like, who gets to say their memory is more true of this relationship? So I think that that's always interesting too, to think about like people growing up in the same family beside each other very closely, and how one person's reality is different even in the same household. So I think that, having those cousins and friends who are closest cousins, those types of relationships do offer growth and nourishment, where you're getting kind of like just another access to be able to kind of look at yourself and question the world. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about your story, and the title is escaping me, where the man's wife has cancer.
Oh, The Loss of Heaven. Yeah.
Yes. And so, he's the same person, but we see him as a husband, and then we see him as the guy at the bar. And I was just like, I don't know how to feel about this man. And I think sometimes when, when you do put them in relationships other than like whatever that primary relationship is, there's so many it adds so many other layers, and it makes for a more pleasurable, like the more difficult the reading experience, the more pleasurable it is for me. Like, I want you to kind of jerk me around a little bit.
I feel that way too. I also think it's really interesting that you say that story in particular, because that's a story where, Fred, the main character of that story, is so concerned with how he appears to be from everybody else. You know what I mean? And so he's kind of checking in on the external. And we do that. We have a tendency to do that, right? Is how am I being perceived? And then does that match up with how I perceive myself, or whatever it is, right? And so I think it also like makes you think more about who are your different selves. I mean, like, we are the person we are, but you have a self that you are when you're doing these events, and you have a self that you are when you enter the classroom and the workspace and the whatever it is, and like those little changes in who we are or how we're presenting ourselves. And is that for protection? Is that just something that we do? Why is that the case? I think it's because like we're not always safe. We don't always feel safe showing up as the people that we are.
Right. Because the fear is great. The fear of rejection, the fear of exposure, and then ultimately like the fear of ourselves. I think sometimes we don't like who we know ourselves to be, but we don't know how to fix that,
how to fix it. And I think that too goes back to, so you were talking about, we were talking about trauma and, writing about trauma, especially as a marginalized person or as a Black person. And I think too, that if we think like, oh, well, I'm expected to do trauma, so now I can't write about, like the shadow work, right? Like being honest about yourself and what roles you play in like your own life and the lives of other people. And I also think that, being able to look at yourself honestly is something that we're not really conditioned to do in our society, right? There are certain things that are inappropriate, they're deemed as bad, but they're actually really just human things that if we were taught to deal with it healthily, we could reduce the harm to ourselves and other people around us. And so like, I think is a project in my work I do want to go to those like darker places, not without joy, not without hope, not without love, but it's like, what am I doing in my work if I'm not willing to be honest about what it fully means to be human?
Yeah. And a specific part of the human experience that I think we both play with, for lack of a better word, is grief.
Yeah.
And how that looks and how we experience it and how other people see us, and the sort of unorthodox ways that grief can show up. That's one of the many things I really appreciate about your work. So
I mean, same. I mean, really, I mean, we're told like, especially in Western culture, right? It's like, oh, it's okay to grieve, but only for this long. And it looks like this. And after this point, then it's like, oh, it's too much. And now you need to get it together and whatever else. But it's like, I don't think of grief as something that goes away, right? It's something that changes shape in your life and you live beside, and it doesn't look one certain way. And it's absolutely individual, right? And I think like, the more we can like show different depictions of what that looks like on the page, maybe that like will open up in somebody else, be like, oh, this is like, okay, I'm not alone in doing this. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a thing that's just weird for me to be doing.
And I can show up for others who are grieving, even if they aren't grieving in the ways that I think they should, or that I may not necessarily.
That I'm accustomed to.
Yes, and easily recognize as grief.
Yeah.
So something else that our collections have in common are that the characters span, across generations. And have you noticed a difference in how readers of different generations respond to your stories?
I mean, I feel like sometimes, I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like the most things that I think people talk about when they talk about my work, if we're talking about readers, right? Whatever generation they come from, is they somehow all pinpoint on these experiences of childhood. You know what I mean? So it's like, however old you are, if you're like, reading, my book, or you're like your book, you're probably past that like initial stage of like childhood. And so it's like, oh, these are things that I didn't know I could talk about. I think especially women readers when they identify with their work. Like when I talk about, I'm like, I talk about in my book, like stuff like, discharge and like bodily functions and fluids and things that you're not supposed to, if you're a polite, like if you're being a young lady, you know what I mean? You don't talk about that kind of stuff. And so it's like we're always growing up afraid to like talk about our own bodies realistically. And so like most of the comments that I got was like, okay, like this is a thing that I never would talk about to anybody in my life, but to see it on the page made me feel really seen. It made me feel like, okay, I wasn't like a bad child for having experienced this. So it's mostly, I think all generations respond to the childhood aspects pretty similarly, which is cool to see. What about you?
I think, what I've heard from readers is that the stories can spark conversations. It can maybe build a bridge between generations because we have because you and I aren't the same generation. I'm Gen X, you're millennial, or you're millennial.
Millennial.
And so, boomers, it was like, don't talk about any of this stuff. Gen Z, as we get older, we're listening, we're kind of we're the bridge between your generation and boomers. And we're like, we're starting to get comfortable with this, especially as we enter our 40s and our 50s. And saying, being silent created harm. Being silent was killing me. Being silent kept me from getting free. So that's not going to work for me anymore. And oh, by the way, it's going to complicate things for you in this, previous generation. And now you're going to be uncomfortable. We got to work this out. And so I love hearing from mothers and daughters who say that they started to talk about things that they'd never talked about before and share experiences they've had that they never shared before with the stories as that bridge to the conversation. So I'm really excited about that. But the thing that kind of makes me sad that multiple generations can relate is it tells me that the church hasn't gotten itself together in 4 generations,
Yeah.
So.
I still, and I, obviously like your book is like the book of church ladies, right? But like one of the things that when we first read each other's books, right? That very first event we did, it was like, I saw so much of what you were doing for your project in the story that I did called Tongues, right? Where it's this, girl who's trying to figure out, she's coming into her own identity and realizing there's a discrepancy between the way that, her pastor and her parents are telling her to view the world and what actually is. And like all of the history hidden beneath what, can be a locus of control. Like the church space can be a place of community and uplift and all of these things, but it can also be a place where you are told how to be. And if you stray outside of that, you are ostracized. You know what I mean? And so I think it's really important to, no matter what the systems are around us, to be thinking about them critically and be thinking about all the time, what are the intentions underneath the words people are saying? Words are really pretty, but like what's underneath that? You know what I mean? And is that causing harm or is it causing, growth?
Yeah. The intentions, the history. I have a conversation coming up with a church in Virginia that is pastored by a millennial, but the congregation are primarily Black boomers, and they read my book and they want to talk. So I'm
so excited for you for that. I think, that's a bridge, right? We're opening the door. Maybe we have different views on that, but like, this is an opportunity to think about something that's important in your life in a different way. That doesn't mean demonize it, right? That doesn't mean like denounce it. That just means be thinking about critically, what can we do to always make sure that we're at the most benefit to the members of our community and ourselves, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
So next question is also mine. In this pandemic era that we've referenced earlier, I think many of us have come to live with an ever-present undercurrent of fear, or I'll just speak for myself. I feel that way.
I have been like, oh my
God. People are like, how are you? I'm like, I'm here. How does this, or does this fear show up in your new writing, in your, we'll call it your pandemic writing? Not necessarily how does the pandemic or the virus itself show up, but fear in general. And from a craft perspective, do you feel obligated to tamp down fear or make things hopeful or happy?
I think I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days because there was just that Hilton Owl's review of Gail Jones's new book where it was like, this is oppression, and it doesn't have any levity to it or whatever it is. And one of the things that Caitlin Greenidge had said, when she was responding to it was like, it's really interesting to think that facing what actually isn't also powerful, isn't also some sort of uplifting, because it takes a lot of work, like I said, to look at oneself honestly and like what is the real situation. And it's also true that the people who's allowed to write on we, basically, right? You know what I mean? It's like people who have like really privileged existences are like more likely get a pass, and it's like, oh, you're perpetuating trauma and this kind of thing. So I think because Milk Blood Heat gets booked as like super dark and super whatever, which, I'm not saying it's not dark, but I don't think it's without light. I think that, because that was my whole entire project. And so it was a little bit for me when I kept hearing people just be like, oh, it's just dark. Oh, these are not happy endings, or these are, whatever. And I was like, I disagree. But like, you know what I mean? You bring, readers will bring whatever experience. But I think from that, I felt a little pressure to feel like, should I be writing more uplifting quotes? And then you have to think about, well, what's uplifting to whom? Who gets to define that? What does that look like? And so I think anytime I start feeling any kind of pressure to do something different than what I feel like I've been called to do, I stop and I have to examine, was that coming from inside me or is it coming from outside me? Is it external? Is it internal? And then when I can identify where it's coming from, then I can kind of go with my motivation. So, but I feel like the book that I'm currently working on is a novel that I was working on before the short stories. So that, they kind of circle similar territories, mothers, daughters, grief, guilt, forgiveness, but also love and like what it means to be a family. What do you actually inherit from the people who make you, right? And I do think that I probably will get like, people are like, I wish that she would write a happier book. And I was like, I think that's coming. I wouldn't say these aren't happy stories, but I have to write what I feel called to. The book after this also is dealing with like real life stuff, but I do see it as maybe taking on a more comic tone, maybe. But yeah, I have felt the fear that you feel, and oftentimes it'll hit me out of nowhere, right? Like I'm just like, oh, I got this new job, and my book just came out. I just got recognized in this cool new way. I feel like I should be happy, and then having to think about, well, what is should be? And what does that mean? And the fact that like it is so hard to process. How can we process the whole ordeal of the pandemic when we're still in it? When we're still getting push and pull about whether or not it's real? Do you know what I mean? And so I think like it's very easy to be like, okay, you got to go to work still. You got to put on this face. You got to do what you got to do, to survive, and then just be hit with like just the impact of it. So I feel you, and you're not alone. And I think that's completely normal to not know what we're supposed to be feeling.
Yeah. I think I play with the extremes of it. I think when so much was uncertain, at like mid-year last year or so, that's when I really started dabbling around with like satirical writing. I think it was just like a kind of escapism. I don't think it was coincidental that, again, it was the first time I wrote a Black man character. Like I was trying to, not me, and getting away from all of the things that I was feeling. I really needed to do that through the character. But then at the same time, I sort of embraced the heaviness as well. And it's like, S.A. Cosby is teaching a workshop on writing violence into your work. I'm there. Somebody else is teaching a horror writing workshop. I'm there. Like I want to play with it and just sort of try and channel it in some new ways. I think that's how I've been dealing with it.
Yeah, and I think you took a couple of classes, and I think I'm on a similar wavelength. I think like, I've been a teacher, and I feel like right now I'm ready to return to being a student. Yeah. So like this summer, I'm like, what workshops can I get into? Just to, I never think of my process or my creativity as like a done thing. It's not something that you perfect. It's something that you just keep experimenting and changing and growing, whatever it is. And so I think I'm ready to return to the space of a student and just be like, okay, what can I learn? What can I take away from this, from my process?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I've been taking classes at the same places where I've been teaching. So it's been
I
really
love
cool.
that.
White Whale and, Catapult and some other
Yeah.
places. That's been really cool. So
yeah, I'm gonna text you later and be like, where have you taken your favorite classes at? Because I'm gonna be on the lookout this summer for a class I
Okay.
could jump into. Yeah.
Cool.
Especially because everything's so virtual and it's like so much easier
Right.
to do
Yep.
that.
Because that was the one thing we could keep doing safely. We could keep reading and we could keep learning.
Keep reading, keep learning. Honestly, I think too, I gained so much more community in 2020 because I had been isolated since 2018 when I graduated from my program, and then I was back home with no, kind of community around me. But just meeting with your friends and writing. Okay, so we still have some time. So I wanted to talk to you about food and literature, especially you, peach cobbler, right? And all kind of things. So both spiritual and physical, though. How are you building this element into your work and the worlds of these characters? And maybe, because we know how it happens in Secret Lives. So maybe you could talk about it a little bit, but maybe like in your new work, how do you find it cropping up?
I don't know if it's possible for me to write a Southern story without food in it. And so it's there. And so I think to the extent that my new stories will take place somewhere else. But it shows up, pretty organically. And so, but you talked about, physical as well as spiritual food. And so I think the spiritual shows up a lot more because all of the characters are hungry for something, something that's not material. Well, they're hungry for material things, but what are the other things of the spirit that they are hungry for? And sometimes they're not even aware of what that hunger is. But also, that's a good question for me as the writer. What is this? What spiritually is this person hungry for, and how can I complicate their process of their journey toward trying to get it? So, how about you?
Same. I think like for me, literature and food is just just together in my mind. Because when I used to love to read when I was little, I would love to eat and read, right? And then like if I was eating and then the characters were also eating, I was like, I felt like more connected in the story. I don't know. Like, so for me, it's something that I guess on an unconscious level, I always build food. And like you, right? Like for me, it just like, that's a thing that people do. It's so important to our lives. Food isn't just what like nourishes us, like on, the physical level, but it can be a spiritual thing, like to eat food, the way it's prepared, like foods of, certain traditions, like our Southern tradition, right? Like I'm in the Midwest now, y'all, and I have not been able to find grits in the grocery store. It is so sad. So I had to like order some offline. It's crazy.
I will text you the link for the best grits in the world, and they sell out. So you got to get like 3 bags at a time.
Seriously, text me. I'm gonna remind you. So like, just thinking about that, I just think it's intrinsic. And like, I didn't realize I was writing these lush food descriptions. So my editor was like, "Oh, you do food so well," and I was like, "Oh, I guess it's super important." So I think too, what does this character need, both physically? What do they not know that they need, right? That they're coming towards, through the narrative, right? Through the narrative arc. Yeah.
Well, I could talk to you all night, but it looks like I got to share you with the folks.
Looks like it's time for questions. Please ask us questions. We like that.
Is Sarah coming back? I think. Yeah, there she is.
Thank you so much. This has just been a fun and inspiring and just full of so many interesting things discussion. So audience members, do please add to the conversation there.
Someone said put the grits link in the chat.
Is that okay? It's called Southern Queen.
Southern Queen? I'm literally writing it down.
Yeah, we'll make a note here.
I need to know. The grit situation has been dire. I don't understand how they're like Southern. I went to a diner. It was like Southern breakfast, but there were no grits. I was like, so how? How?
That's a fake. That is fake.
That's not real.
Breakfast.
That's not real.
I agree with you on that. I'm from Texas, which is not the South the way the South is, but yes, grits are vital. Ooh, thank you for the link. That's great.
There you go.
Good. So to toss in a couple of questions. So we're talking here about short stories, and interestingly, we had a short story related event just a couple of weeks ago with Hilma Wolitzer. And one of the things that she and her daughter Meg Wolitzer, both of them substantial fiction writers, got to talking about was how you have an idea. How do you know which idea wants to be a short story versus it wants to be a novel or any other longer form. And did you find in writing the short stories here, did anything say this is not going to work as a short story, it wants to be a longer form, or any of the characters saying tell my fuller story, or maybe that's not the formula?
Yeah, an idea is in trouble if it comes to me and wants to be a novel, because I don't know.
I was just going to say, I don't know that I know that. I don't know that I know.
Good luck. Sorry to that idea. It's not gonna happen, because I started out trying to write novels, and I was hitting walls, but I was working on these stories, and my agent had the idea to just stop with the novel and get intentional about the stories. And then even after the collection was done, I said, okay, I'm going to go back to the novel. I have some great ideas. I reworked the novel over the last year in some ways, and then lost interest again, if I'm honest. Like, now I'm finally being honest with myself. I just lost interest. And then here are the stories. And now here's some essays. And now, some flash essays. Like, I'm doing everything but writing a novel. So I have just surrendered to the idea that everything that comes to me is going to be short form. So.
Yeah, I'm in the process of writing a novel right now, but the way that I have gotten I'm in the second draft, but the way that I have gotten myself through the drafts is to treat each chapter like it's its own short story. I like title them and everything. And so I'm just like, I don't know, I don't know. This thing came to me. I think I have wanted to be a writer for a very long time, but nobody ever tells you like, oh, novelist / short story writer. It's just like, you're going to write a novel.
Right.
Like, you want to be a writer, you write a novel. And then so like, when I started writing short stories, it wasn't until I started taking workshops and then, started reading more short stories. And it's just a form that comes really naturally to me. Like, I can see the whole arc of it. You can hold it in your mind differently than you can a novel. And it can do just as much emotional work as a 300-page, novel. Not saying there's nothing against novels. I'm not like, anti-novel over here. I'm just saying that I don't know yet. I don't know yet, basically.
We need Donnie here. This is why we are the 3Ds. We need Donnie to talk about
Donnie
that.
rounds us out. Yeah.
Yes, the sense that if you're a writer, well, you must be writing a novel. That's, yeah. So one of the things that you said that really touched me, and I'm sure did other people as well, something along the lines of talking about portrayals of grief. The more ways we can show that on the page, the more likely someone, and I just noted it as, the more likely someone will see that as a valid way of grieving, which was not the phrase that anybody used. And that was striking to me because that's a formulation that I tend to associate with memoirs rather than fiction, but maybe I'm wrong-headed about that. Can you talk a little bit about how it's personal or not personal, or something you want to portray to add validity to people's experience?
Yeah, I think for me, fiction is a kind of truth. Like the fiction that, it's like, oh yeah, it's fiction, it's made up, but like it tells things so real and in a way that sometimes I think memoir can't. The other thing I think too is that, like, when I think about people are being, oh, memoirs are real events. And I'm like, well, memory is a kind of fiction, right? It's going to be different depending on, two people could be looking at the same event and come away with different ideas about what actually happened. And also we have our memories degrade. When you remember something, you're remembering the last time you remembered it, not the event itself, which is why they become fuzzy. That's why they become foggy. So like things shift and change, and things that are supposedly all the way true too. It's true from one or a few perspectives, right? And so someone else is going to have a different truth. So I think fiction for me, I really love thinking about like people is like my main motivation. Like, why are we the way we are? And I'll look at something and I'll say, so like if I took something that a conversation I overheard, whatever, that little seed of truth, that's a jumping off point for me to get to my deeper questions about whatever was striking me or calling to me and what I witnessed. You know what I mean? And it's a way for me to kind of leave the page of like, okay, this is what actually happened. Those two people had a conversation and they left. And I'm like, okay, but what happened when they left and went home? What happens when they're in their separate places? And how did that, conversation evolve separately for them both? And I can do that via fiction.
Yeah. And I think, for me, two things. Dantiel mentioned memory driving a lot of fiction, coming together, memory, nostalgia, imagination, and so for those of us who have grief experience or have loved people who were grieving. And if that's part of our, memories, it's fodder, it becomes fodder for the fiction. And for me, I'm less interested in sort of telling people, how to feel about a thing than to stir the questions, right? So there's a lot of grief in my collection, but the story that comes to mind most immediately is one called Not Daniel. And these two people are grieving. Their mothers are in hospice, and they have a sexual encounter, and he's married. And so, are people able to think about them as grieving, or are they turned off by the fact that, oh, look at what, he's married? Can you get past that and see the grief? And then start thinking about, well, how does grief show up? And, times when we were grieving in unorthodox ways, and nobody recognized it, and nobody could meet us where we were. And then I'm hoping that would get people to think more about how they show up for other people who are grieving, and what could grief look like that I didn't think it could look like, or I haven't allowed myself to recognize as grief.
Yeah, Deesha, and it seems like you think probably the same way as me. As the person who's creating the characters in the world, it's not my place to judge these characters, right?
Right.
The other characters in the book will judge them. The characters will judge themselves. But me, I'm just trying to, this is this person. This is what it is. I'm not trying to lead anybody to some sort of moral conclusion. I'm just depicting as three-dimensionally as possible people.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so like that really allows for more possibilities on the page when you yourself as the writer are not judging the characters that you're putting in these various situations.
Yeah.
I admit, from my perspective, she was not a writer I was familiar with until a few months ago, but really striking because there's just the one past really major work, right? And then there's this brand new book. Can you talk a little bit more about her impact on your writing? And should we all read the new book? I assume we should.
Yes. Yes. I got an arc of it, and absolutely, yes, read it. One of the things that Gail Jones, her life and work, the way that it's influenced me is knowing that there's so much risk that she takes. If you write about sex and other things, that there are people who are going to only focus on the sex, and they're going to miss other things that you're doing. If you write about Black life in really unapologetic ways, there are going to be people that are reductive about that and miss so much of what you're trying to do. And so you take these risks, but then there's also this comfort that the people who can see themselves in your characters, that they're going to get it and they're going to appreciate it. And I don't know if any of these things matter to Gail Jones, but they matter to me. And so I see her over the span of her career. It has spanned, her first novel came out in 1975 when she was 26 years old. And so, she's her next one, she's written other novels since then, but this latest one is, 46 years later, that it's worth the risk, that it is absolutely worth the risk to be able to write those stories that matter to you, that ask the questions that you care about, that center the people that you want to center. It's absolutely worth it. And that's what I've, taken away, and that you can, my friend Robert Jones, who wrote The Prophets, he reviewed that book. He reviewed Moniz, I think that's how you pronounce it, for the New York Times. And I was wondering who was going to review it and how were they going to get to the fact that it's a lot. And he said it so beautifully. He said, this book requires patience.
Yes.
And I want to write books and stories that require patience and have people be willing to read them.
Yeah.
And she did that. And I'm just in awe.
I'm the same too. I want, I don't mind asking a reader to do some of the work, to, do the close reading. I don't mind that in my stories. And some people might not like that, but that's okay. You know what I mean? Because I'm okay with that. I think I also came to Gail Jones really late. But I think for me, what I take away from her career as a writer is like, you write, like you said, what you're called to write, whatever that thing is, whatever that looks like, without worrying about what the external perception will be. And then also, like, you give the work when you're ready to give the work, not on some like bullshit capitalist productive, like one book a year. You know, the work comes when it comes, and that's okay. Do you know what I mean? Like if it takes me, you know, a year to write this next book, or 10. I think Danielle Evans is somebody also that I think about in terms of like the work is ready when the work is ready.
That's right.
Yeah,
she does. And it's always worth the wait.
And it's so good. Shout
out to Danielle. Woo! Office of Historical Corrections.
Yes. Oh my God.
Before you
suffocate your own full self.
Yes.
Before you suffocate your own full
self.
self.
I always forget the word suffocate.
Okay, good. I'm glad you put Donnie's name in there. Yes. Check out the final revival of Opal and Nev. I think Donnie is joining us in short stories soon, isn't she?
Yes.
Yeah.
She is. And she has a short story, we both do, in the current issue of Oxford American, their summer lit issue. She has a wonderful story called The High Shelf, or The Highest Shelf, and it's exquisite. It's so Duval too. You got it if you haven't read it yet. Yeah.
Things you want to toss in, please do. I was just going to ask our authors. So we've had some, obviously, read your 2 wonderful books and keep an eye out for future things. What else have you read lately or are looking forward to reading that you would recommend to us or unrecommend to us? If there's something that we couldn't bother with, that's good too.
I'm not going to be a haterade. I'm not going to unrecommend.
Because you know, the Bookstagrammers got us with that kill. Was it?
Oh, that kill, marry, throw away? No, something like that.
Something, yeah. Well, we had to get rid of like Toni Morrison,
in the trash.
Which was horrible. It was
Toni
terrible.
Morrison or just the greats. They wanted to spit the greats in the trash.
Yeah,
awful. You go first.
Well, and I also saw Maureen's question, which was about places to take classes. So Catapult is a great literary site, but they also offer classes. The Porch, Tennessee, offers classes. Story Studio Chicago is another place. A Public Space.
Oh yes, a Public Space
offers classes.
Yeah.
And White Whale Bookstore. Our friends at White Whale, they are such friends to authors and readers, and they offer amazing classes. And most, if not all of the places I mentioned, offer scholarships, things like that, so that these classes are accessible. And to answer the question, though, I'll shout out Dante Stewart's book. It's a memoir called Shouting in the Fire, an American Epistle, and he's grappling with being Black, Christian, and American when the evangelical church, has its roots in so much white supremacy. So the book is a reckoning. It's a blueprint for the church to get its act together, and the writing is just tremendous.
That's
yeah. So I'll keep shouting out writers then. Candace Marie Benbow. I never get her subtitle right, but it's called Red Lip Theology. So if anybody wants to pull up the full subtitle, it's such a great book. And so she's a Black woman millennial, whereas Dante is a Black man millennial. And, she's writing about reckoning with the church and Christianity from a feminist and millennial perspective. So Red Lip Theology is another one. Dantiel.
Hi, am I back?
Yep, you're back.
It just was like what? So I recently read Benita Blackburn's How to Wrestle a Girl. It's a short story collection.
I have it.
God. Yeah, really, really good. And then this book isn't out yet, but it'll be out. I just read Cayman Chang also has a short story collection that's going to be coming out. Just honestly, line by line language is just like, so you have to wait a little bit on that, but just be looking out for Cayman Chang's new book also.
So much for joining us this evening. Thank you for the enthusiasm and wisdom and recommendations of books and grits and everything else. We really appreciate it. So I'm just going to pop up on the screen a couple of the things that we have coming up.